Well, thank you, Simone, for that introduction and for inviting me here today. I'm happy to be here. So you've heard about mirror neurons, some of you, maybe not all of you, and their potential to explain human behavior, all aspects of human behavior virtually. But are these rumors true? That's the question that I'm going to be asking today. What I want to do is introduce you to mirror neurons in detail, explain why psychology and neuroscience got so excited about mirror neurons and their properties, and then why the interpretation of them that's out in the literature is, in my view, incorrect. Okay, for those of you who haven't seen mirror neurons or heard of them before, they have been claimed to be the cells that shaped civilization, a discovery that would do for psychology what DNA did for biology, the tiny miracles that get us through the day, that bind us with each other mentally and emotionally. So what's at stake? What are we actually talking about here? Why are they so interesting? And the reason is that they promise to explain the big three, is what I'm calling this, in the human mind. Language, mind reading, so-called, and imitation. Language is the power to transplant complex information from one mind to another, to take a thought in my head and get it through air pressure waves into your mind. Mind reading refers to the ability to recognize that behavior is caused by mental states in other individuals, and that other individuals have their own mind that cause their behavior. This is also referred to as theory of mind. And imitation, according to some, is the foundational mechanism for all of these. In fact, some researchers have called the human species, or proposed to call the human species, Homo imitans. Each of these is a scientific industry in its own right, all backed by their own complex cognitive theories, and none of them are particularly well understood in neuroscience or evolution. In the late 1980s, some clues to solving these problems came out of Parma, not too far from here. Giacomo Rizzolatti was investigating southern pigtail macaque monkeys. He was interested in how monkeys used information about object shape to guide their actions. They're reaching towards these objects. And he was doing neurophysiological experiments in awake, behaving monkeys, recording from an area known as F5 in the motor cortex of these monkeys, recording individual neurons. In this area, you can find, or he found, that there are cells that will respond preferentially to grasping actions of a particular sort. Here, a cell is responding preferentially to grasping a ring and not to grasping other objects. Interestingly, these same cells that responded specifically to types of grasping actions also responded simply by looking at the object to be grasped. This property of these neurons was taken to be reflecting a mechanism whereby object shape information can be used to guide or select appropriate grasping behaviors for those objects. During these experiments, an interesting thing happened. The monkeys were reaching into a box to grasp these objects, and in between trials, the experimenters would have to switch objects, and they would reach in and grab these objects. They noticed something interesting. As they were listening to the cells firing away during the experiment, they noticed that some of these same cells responded during the reaching actions that the experimenters were doing as they were setting up the experiment. So they set up an experiment to investigate this. They studied 184 neurons in one monkey, executing grasping actions and observing objects of various sorts. And here is what they found. 48 neurons responded to viewing objects. That's what had been found previously. 39 of them responded during viewing actions. That was the new finding. 12 of the 39 showed a correspondence between preferred execution and observation, grasp type. So here's an illustration of one of these cells responding during the monkey's action, grasping of an object. And these are the neurons firing. And here's that same cell firing while the monkey just watches the experimenter do the same thing. So this is what has come to be called mirroring, and I'll just repeat it. 12 of the 39 showed a correspondence between the preferred execution, the grasp type that it responded to, and the observation of the grasp type. That's a mirror neuron. And let me emphasize, this is the piece of data that has influenced all of these theories. This is the basic data that has led to inferences about how these cells can explain everything from language to empathy to autism. This result was replicated in a subsequent experiment that was published in 1996. They studied 2 monkeys and a lot more neurons and found exactly the same thing. The result was real. So why all the excitement? If I came in here and told you that I found 12 cells that responded during observation and execution of action, you wouldn't automatically connect it to the sorts of things that it's been connected to and make claims like cells that read minds or Dalai Lama neurons or the neurons that shaped civilization. It's not the empirical observation or the data that got everyone excited, it's the interpretation. And here is that interpretation, a quote from Rizzolatti. We understand action because the motor representation of that action is activated in our brain. So let me illustrate. When you reach out to grasp a cup of coffee, you understand what your own grasp means. So the question is, how do you understand my action when I'm doing the same thing? Rizzolatti's idea was that the way you understand other people's action is by simulating that action in your own motor system. And by simulating it in your own motor system, since you know what it means when you do it, you will automatically understand what my action means. It's action understanding by motor simulation. The other important fact that made the mirror neurons very famous was they immediately extrapolated the existence of a mirror system in humans. I believe that mirror neurons do exist in humans. There have been some doubters, but in my mind, there is no question. And there have been a couple of research papers to show directly that mirror neurons do exist in humans. So how did it go from action understanding in mirror neurons to human empathy in virtually the whole human mind? Here's the idea. These are the big 3 human mind abilities that I mentioned. Language is a kind of action. Therefore, the idea is that the way we understand language is by simulating the action of generating language. The ability to read others' minds, that is, infer what they're thinking, is also a kind of simulation. You put yourself in their shoes and imagine what their thoughts are that lead to the behaviors that they generate. And imitation is quite readily explained by mirror neurons because you take information about the action that was perceived and map that onto a similar action in your own motor system. After mirror neurons were discovered, these 3 areas were theorized to be supported by mirror neurons. Language on the top, simulation or mind reading theory here in this paper, and imitation in a paper that came out in 1999. Once you explain the big 3, empathy is within sight. Empathy can be thought of as putting yourself in someone else's emotional shoes and literally feeling the pain that they're experiencing. And not surprisingly, a theory of empathy based on mirror neurons was proposed in 2001. As you can see here from the symptoms from these abilities, this is the roots of the broken mirror theory of autism, because individuals with autism have trouble with exactly these things. And, not surprisingly, a mirror neuron-based theory of autism was proposed in 2001. From there, many other human abilities or cultural ideas have been explained with mirror neurons, including art and sports appreciation, romantic love, humanity, civilization, culture follow from that. And that pretty much explains virtually the whole human mind. It's for this reason that this one simple piece of data led people like Ramachandran to say it is the big bang of human evolution. After these theoretical papers came out, the number of scientific papers publishing on mirror neurons dramatically rose. Here is when the first mirror neuron paper was published in 1996. This is the time when the theories were being proposed, and then you can see the number of scientific papers explodes after that. Mirror neurons in the scientific literature have been implicated in a whole range of behaviors, from sexual orientation to misattribution of anger in the music of avant-garde jazz saxophonists. If you just Google mirror neurons, you'll find all sorts of other things. For example, how Barack Obama is tapping into your brain via mirror neurons, how sex equals mirror neurons, how gay mirror neurons come out, and so on. The reason why mirror neurons became so popular is because they explain complex mental functions simply, and it has a tangible neural mechanism with an evolutionary kicker. I can explain the whole thing to you, as I've done just now, in about 10 or 15 minutes. My own personal perspective is here. This is my timeline of interest in mirror neurons. This is when I first heard of mirror neurons. This is when I didn't care much about mirror neurons. This is when I decided I needed to learn about them and taught a course on mirror neurons. And this is when I published a critical review of mirror neurons based on what I learned. So why didn't I care about mirror neurons? It's because I'm a speech scientist, and I knew that the explanation of the mirror neuron explanation for language simply couldn't work. Individuals with Broca's aphasia have very severe speech production problems, but by definition do not have similar speech recognition or comprehension problems. This shows very clearly that mirror neurons can't explain language deficits. This is why I started to care about mirror neurons, because my own research involved neuroscience of sensory motor processes in speech and language. And my own functional brain imaging experiments was showing activation in Broca's area, a mirror neuron related area, during the perception of speech. So when I started looking at the foundation of mirror neurons and in connection with my own area, I wanted to know whether this foundational assumption, this inference right here, was accurate. Was the jump from these observations to the simulation theory correct or not? We can't tell just from the monkey data, and we can't tell just from the imaging data, because this is purely correlational. It doesn't tell us about causation. So I looked at the data, and I came up in this course that I taught I noticed a whole host of anomalies, things that didn't fit the mirror neuron theory. The first one I already mentioned, it is the case of speech. Here's another. You can understand actions that you can't execute, like flying or coiling or locomotion by jet propulsion. And there are plenty of human actions that you can't execute but can nonetheless understand. Here's another anomaly, Moebius Syndrome. This is a condition of congenital facial paralysis. So there's an inability to execute facial emotions. They can't express them. The question is, can they recognize them? And the answer is yes, they can recognize them as well as control subjects across the range of emotional expressions. In the service of time, I think I'm going to skip this anomaly, but basically it's that the mirror system is malleable, it's plastic, whereas comprehension doesn't seem to change. A fifth anomaly is that the movements themselves are actually ambiguous in meaning. So if you look at this movement, that can mean a whole range of different things depending on the context. So for example, this is pouring if we're talking about it from the perspective of the water in the vessel. It's filling if we're talking about it from the perspective of the vessel that's being filled. But the actions are the same. Mirror neurons, as measured in monkeys, have exactly the same properties. They don't fire when there's no object involved. The context is important. So mirror neurons are not simply simulating or resonating with perceived actions. They only resonate when the context is right. The notes are up there. So then we have to ask, how do they know when the context is right, if the mirror neurons are supposed to be responsible for telling us what the action means, and where is that understanding coming from? So I want to spend a few minutes kind of giving you a reverse perspective on mirror neurons. The idea is that action and perception are indeed tightly linked, like mirror neuron theory says, but it's action that's grounded in perception and not the other way around. And I want to illustrate this with a very interesting case of an individual who acquired what's called large fiber sensory neuropathy. He lost the ability to feel his body from the neck down. His motor system was completely unaffected, and yet he couldn't move. He needed that sensory information about his body state in order to even generate an action. So you might ask, is there a sensory alternative to the mirror system? And in fact, there is. It's a region called the superior temporal cortex. And this is a region that also has cells that respond to the observation of actions in a very specific way, in fact, more specific than you see in the mirror system. And in humans, this area is implicated in biological motion perception. This set of dots just looks like a set of dots until I animate it. As soon as it's animated, you can see the human form. Our brains are very good at picking out this information from very little movement. So here's the thing I want to emphasize, though. That doesn't mean that the superior temporal sulcus is where action understanding happens. It's a much more complicated system. In fact, it likely involves a whole range of brain areas, including all of these listed here. So what are mirror neurons doing? The group in Parma actually had it right in their very first paper. They argued that mirror neurons were not, or suggested that mirror neurons may not be doing action understanding, but instead might be using information about other monkeys' or humans' actions to select appropriate actions. To say it differently, it is basically the same mechanism that's involved in object grasping. It's taking visual information and using that to select appropriate actions, which we certainly need to do in response to other people's actions. The reason why this idea was abandoned had to do with imitation. Macaques don't tend to imitate like humans do, and this led to a rejection of that idea, but it's probably more detail than we need to go into today. Okay, so I'm going to skip some more things and get to some conclusions. So, in summary, mirror neurons are real, but they're not the basis of all things human. They are part of the sensory motor system underlying motor control. Action understanding and communication, which is what mirror neurons were intended to explain, is based on a widespread neural network, not a single system or a single class of neurons. And I didn't have time to talk about it, but I'll give you the punchline. The standard view of autism may be completely backwards. Grazie.
Grazie.